afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to our latest lecture in our British Institute for Libyan and Northern African Studies lecture series. Just a very small bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you do have questions for our speaker, please type them into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and then we will ask them at the end of the lecture. So today we are very pleased to have with us Dr. Anna Wallace. Anna is an archaeologist and ancient historian of Roman frontiers with a focus on North Africa and Britain. She completed an MPhil from the University of Cambridge and a PhD in archaeology from the University of Leicester. She is a member of the Frontiers of the Roman Empire World Heritage Site Advisory Group and the MENA subgroup, and she's also the chair of the Theoretical Roman Archaeology Conference. So last year, we were very pleased to award Anna with one of our BILNIS postdoctoral writing fellowships, in which she has used over the past year to work on her monograph on the site of Bu Njem in Libya. And so that's what she's going to tell us about some of this work today in her lecture, which is entitled Excavating Archives, New Perspectives on the Roman Military Base at Bu Njem, Libya. And so Anna, please, over to you. You're muted, Anna.
Oh, typical. Yes, so that's right. Let's recompose ourselves. Thank you ever so much for very generously inviting me to give this lecture. It's an immense pleasure. And also I am very aware that I'm speaking in front of many specialists from across the world. So I very much look forward to the discussion and to your helpful feedback. First of all, I would like to thank the British Institute for Libyan and North African Studies for providing me with the opportunity to speak today. The presentation would not be possible without the Institute's generous support. The material I'm presenting today derives both from the time afforded thanks to the Postdoctoral Writing Fellowship, but also a previous travel grant award, which resulted in the publication of an article in 2022. I would also like to acknowledge the generosity of Somka Museum, and thanks to it and the fantastic staff there, I have been able to have a look at some of the archives. Part of the book that I'm writing concerns the question of how to bring together the archaeologies of Roman armies and those of local communities, and how we interpret the material from Bu Njem. The site's revised understanding is needed to facilitate modern interpretations of the frontier that reflect changing archaeological agendas. Whilst professing to offer a new perspective on a matter can often presume the existence of a proverbial strawman, this is very much not the case. Significant advances in our understanding of the frontier since the completion of Professor Rebuffor's fieldwork, obviously originally undertaken in 1960s and 70s, provide a fantastic opportunity to build further on these achievements and to look at the site in a renewed detail. My work also draws from examples of approaches from elsewhere in the empire, such as Hadrian's Wall, and here particularly the contemporary Severan Wall's End, and from Dura Europos, a model for understanding militarized urban spaces. I'm pretty sure that many of you will be familiar with the location of the site, but if not, here's just a quick orientation as to where we are. And I suppose, as many of you who are joining us today, I was drawn to the site because of the wealth of its evidence and its complexity. Two strands are central to this work, really. One, of course, focuses on the ancient military base and its settlement. And second one is really around the history of archaeological engagement with the site as driven by political, colonial, and military agendas of the time. So here is, of course, the military enclosure, and we will be looking at the extramural settlement, not particularly visible in this photograph later on. But here is also a remnant of that wider archaeological landscape. How can we come to interpret the site the way we do? This question is the subject of my in-progress work, and given that this is a special lecture, I would love to share with you some of the early stage findings which perhaps haven't been refined just yet. And many of you are familiar with this satellite image of the fort. And as you see, there's also the remnant of an Italian occupation, which started in 1928 and materialized in 1929 by the construction of a colonial Italian fort, providing opportunities for gathering new material. And an excavation was conducted in the Count's Baths in 27, with two inscriptions from it being discovered, but also a number of other texts. The collection provided Renato Bertoccini with the opportunity for a comprehensive study. And here's a photograph of the nearby Italian colonial fort. You might wonder, why am I bringing this to your attention? Well, the involvement of colonial Italian forces in the work has so far only been mentioned in passing. I would like to share with you a series of photographs dated to around 1930 and that might shed a little bit of further light. These signal the military's involvement in procurement of inscriptions and also a level of identification with the Roman past. And many of the works whose covers you saw in one of my earlier slides dealt quite extensively with the issues of colonial legacies in the discipline. Work on identifying the unit and the individual in the photographs is, of course, ongoing. So if you have any more information, I would love to find out more. Could these be the men that provide the material for Bertoccini to study? The photographs belong to a decommissioned archive of an Italian overseas territories press agency. And I was incredibly fortunate in being able to procure copies of it in a very remote little antiquarian shop in Milan. The entanglement of modern militaries with discovery of Bu Njem does not end there. Um, What you can see here is, of course, images of some of the soldiers excavating a stone. And this is one of the very few photographs of some of the local people that were also involved in the work. And very often, as it is in the context of photographs, of course, the images are very interesting themselves, but also what's behind them in the didascalia can be particularly interesting. So here, the text on the back of this photograph says, La lapide dell'impero viene dissepolata dalle sabbie. The stone of the empire is unearthed from the sands. Here we've got another image, again, with a didascalia, suggesting that the stone praising the empire re-emerged from the centuries-old sands after our reoccupation of Bu Njem. And as you can imagine, these are likely the officers or the soldiers that would have been stationed in the nearby colonial fort. I'm pretty sure that many of you are squinting and looking to find out which inscription is underneath the feet of this gentleman here. And I was able to very quickly find which one that is. And it is IRT 914, and it was actually originally published by Bartoccini in Africa Italiana. So it is perfectly possible that when Rebufo referred to information being passed on by the military to Bartoccini, these could have been some of the men that were involved in this. As you can also see, there's another element of didascalia on the back of this photograph. And again, the personal connectedness between European colonial forces and the discovery of military sites in Roman Africa comes to the fore. And I guess I would love to just say that this offers an additional strand of information or continuum to our thinking about how colonial legacies have affected the way we study Roman frontiers. What is perhaps also interesting is that the story does not end just there. Um, Here is a photograph or an element of a newspaper from the Minneapolis Star dated to December 1942, and you can see Bu Njem, location of Bu Njem implicated in news coverage of some of the activities during World War II. A memoir of Lieutenant Genovesi, who served during Romer's first offensive in North Africa in 1941, provides further information. He refers to Bu Njem as the Devil's Well, focusing mostly on the earlier colonial fort and the miserable fall palm trees he describes in the oasis, as well as mentioning the existence of a local oasis community in passing. We normally do not get to hear about them at all. What we do also find out from his account is that already in 1941 there were mines left on the route to the side by the British military forces. The early 20th century military occupation, however, is not just an interesting point or an anecdote, but instead feeds directly into how the site was previously understood and studied. This is the case both physically, as you can see from this coverage by a newspaper, Sunday Gibili, and I apologize for horrible pronunciation, a newspaper published by the government press of the British military administration in Tripoli. We find out that the work of René Buffon was impacted by the presence of landmines. As it says in the article, the whole area is littered with ammunition dumps. The influence, however, as we know, was also theoretical under various guises of colonial thinking and its influence on archaeological theory and approaches to presenting the frontier as a defensive barrier. The focus on defensive aspects of the site has meant that just as early 20th century European accounts of the site do not pay too much attention to the wider community of the area, we do not know very much about the Roman period extended military community of Bu Njem, even though the site provides one of the best excavated examples of an extramural settlement in North Africa. How did the fort work in the context of the civilian town, which has a much larger than the fort area? What do we know of the extramural community? Thanks to desert conditions, the preservation of the site at the time of its excavation proved extraordinary on the scale of the whole of the Roman Empire. The site was excavated by mission led by Professor Rebufo between 1967 and 1980, with the objective being that of establishing the fort layout and tracing the extent of the extramural settlement. And here I would just love to share with you two photographs. One, a working shot of some of the local people working in the excavations. You can see some of the archaeologists in the background, and also this rather charming photograph of the gang from 1969. If you're able to help recognize some of these faces, do let me know. Past research focused very much on the military enclosure of Bu Njem, leaving it perhaps in a little bit of a separation from the extramural settlement and from the content of the ostraca. Instead, much of the previous work focused on the morphology of the fort and the composition of the garrisons, as these are the key questions that needed answering when studying Roman military presence. This opens the opportunity to study the garrison as an extended military community in its interconnected social, cultural, and economic setting. Since the completion of field work, there have been significant advances to the research on the Garamantes, the understanding of trade in the Sahara, and the nature of Rome's North African frontiers. These advances enable rethinking the interpretation of the evidence. I hope that the results can help recognize the urban character of the garrison settlement and improve the understanding of social and economic activities on the frontier. The garrison at Bu Njem was founded under Septimius Severus in AD 201 and abandoned between AD 259 and 263. Epigraphic evidence shows that the fort was built by Vexillatio Legio III Augusta. In AD 238, the legion was dissolved as punishment for participating in the revolt of Gordian I, and afterwards Bu Njem was occupied by attachments of legionaries, although whether these were different men or the same men under a different title has been raised as a question recently. The legion is attested epigraphically at Bu Njem again soon after its reconstitution in AD 253, and its detachment remained at Bu Njem until the site's abandonment. Revealed during the excavation campaign was a dossier of 146 pieces of correspondence on ostraca. This archive presents a partial and somewhat haphazard selection of documents, yet, in terms of its size and content, the dossier can only be compared to a handful of other military archives from across the entire empire. The ostraca records daily activities of soldiers, assignments within and outside the camp, and also reveals circulation of personal, civilians, and goods. Subsequent research in the context of the ostraca and inscription has focused on the linguistic and literary perspective on the text. Work on the linguistic aspects, particularly by Adams and Cooley, brought to the fore the multicultural and multilingual identities of the inhabitants of Bu Njem. But so far, the archaeological remains of the text have not really been studied in detail side by side with the text. This work integrates the textual data with archaeological spatial data, as well as both the military base and the extramural settlement, to trace the urban character of the site, activities in the base, passage through the fort, trade, and long-distance connectivity. I hope to provide a slightly more inclusive interpretation of Bu Njem's frontier communities. At the time of the excavation, some 50 or 60 years ago, Rebufo saw it as operating alongside a chain of smaller military outposts protecting caravan routes. Subsequent surveys between Bu Njem and Geriat El Garbia challenged the identification of intermediary sites between the two bases as military outposts. Instead, the surveys, UNESCO Libyan Valley Survey and fantastic work by Professor Rede, provided evidence that the sites in question were native settlements. With distances between confirmed military outposts exceeding 100 kilometers, rather than protected militarized routes as originally thought, the Army's presence in the area reflected monitoring general circulation on trackways. A limited militarization of the frontier is also suggested by the present knowledge regarding the size of Bu Njem's garrison. Rebufo originally estimated the site to be holding about 400 to 500 men, but these estimates have shrunk by roughly 40%, with Professor Mackensen proposing a theoretical maximum strength of between 250 and 300 men for the period when Goliath was occupied by Vexillatio Golensis. Daily strength reports might suggest that the number of men on duty could have been more modest. In fact, at times Bu Njem's actual strength could have been less than 200 men, including those who were in practice on outpost duties or unfit for service. This is very much a similar situation to what is recorded at Vindolanda in terms of the difference between paper strength and the real strength attested in the garrison. With a small force, the garrison had limited ability to control the area, prompting questions whether such control was needed or indeed necessary given the lack of evidence for tensions in the vicinity in the period. Beyond patrols attested in the Ostraka, routine activity of the garrison consisted of responding to small-scale local aggressions and overseeing trade activities. Such routine events are likely the subject of graffiti incised in the walls of Principia building. One scene depicts a group of men carrying shields walking away from the fort, representing either training or a detachment on the move. Routine patrols tackling bandit groups and deterring small aggressions were likely much of the action that Bu Njem witnessed. This level of danger would not have been unexpected in most pacified frontier areas. The frontier was not intended to be managed in the way envisaged by early research, which tended to focus on the frontier's defensive capabilities against then poorly understood peoples from beyond the frontier. Past emphasis on defenses is also echoed in research on Bu Njem in the focus on the monumental ramparts and gates, in contrast, for example, to a lesser focus on the fines assemblage, which has recently been described as a very obvious lacuna in our knowledge of Bu Njem. In practice, the fort defenses might not have been obvious from the narrow surrounding streets of the town, but instead towering over the settlement when seen from a distance. This is perhaps not the impression given by a much celebrated graffito of the facade of presumably Bu Njem as it floats in an empty space. New insights into the Army's presence in the region have been accompanied by expansion of work on communities beyond the frontier. Among the reasons for undertaking a significant excavation campaign in Bu Njem was the site's position as a waypoint on several transportation routes, including from Jafra Oasis and on a route to Tripoli via Girza and Beni Ulid. At the time of Rebufo's excavation, little was known about the Garamantis, with subsequent major projects bringing to light the significance of the civilization and of its economic power as the context for Rome's interest in the region. Recent studies of material culture have emphasized the flow of goods from Roman Empire in the direction of the Garamantis and explored the evidence for reciprocal trade, including in organic materials. The findings indicate the importance of trade and relationships between Roman authorities and local communities, both on the frontier and beyond the frontier. These recent advances to research on trade in the Sahara provide context for development of Rome's interest in the southern regions of Tripolitania, suggesting the role of Bu Njem in the empire's effort to tap into profits to be made alongside trade routes associated with the Garamantes. To actualize the potential, the Severan frontier moved south with a series of forts established nearby oases, Bu Njem being accompanied by installations at Geriad, El Garbi, and Gadames, all situated at the end of routes leaving from Fazan. The pushing of frontiers towards south under Septimius Severus is also seen in Britain and in the Middle East. As Bu Njem was a major terminus for caravans at the end of a dry stretch, an important role of the military was to oversee the caravan movement. A key piece of evidence in this context is reference to a statio camelariorum on the duty rosters read in the context of provision of water and services to passing caravans. Beyond keeping an eye on the movement and safety of travelers, the question remains whether the statue was also involved in tax income generation. This was originally the view proposed by Marichal, using a parallel with Egyptian evidence to suggest a military role in collection of portorium. Gedon has highlighted that statute does not systematically designate a customs post, and that assignments at Fiscum in the Ostraka might better cover this meaning, casting doubt on the role of the fort in generation of tax. My preferred alternative solution is that proposed by Professor Wilson, suggesting that rather than collecting the tax on entry to Bu Njem, the garrison supplied the traders with documentation stipulating the tax to be paid on arrival to the destination market, parallel to the evidence from the Red Sea region. This is a useful proposal, given that while there is no direct evidence for customs extraction on the Saharan borders, a tax on imports from outside the provinces seems to have been the norm across the empire. I would also like to propose to look further away from the direct vicinity of the fort, as it is possible that the frontier forts like Bu Njem might have been bases for detachments engaged in tax-related missions elsewhere, either through direct engagement in tax generation, as envisaged by Marichal, or, as seems likely, through providing security for the collected revenue. Engagement of the garrison in civilian administration is evident in involvement in population census on Ostraka Bu Njem number 37. And of course, the ultimate purpose of a census is to serve for tax assessment purposes. This reminds us of the colonial realities of the role of army in generating revenue for the empire and extracting from local communities. Questions have been raised as to whether the Ostraka statue was located inside or outside the main military area. In Wilson's scenario, forts would be the obvious checkpoints. In instances when the Ostraka record Goliath soldiers are sent to posts away from the garrison, these are precisely identified by their toponyms, suggesting that statia relate to a place within Bu Njem. I propose that perhaps most caravans would be kept outside of the fort enclosure but under military surveillance, with only the caravans bringing supplies for the garrison brought inside the fort itself. Such a distributed system would likely require surveillance posts at key points within the garrison town and the military base to control access and flow. The reference to statio is accompanied by several more generic references to cum camelos or cum camelis on three ostraka and ad camelos on another one. The references could potentially designate a catch term for several locations within the fort and the garrison town where soldiers oversaw caravans. In this setup, the statue itself would be located either within the extramural settlement or in the immediate hinterland of the walled town. Here, for comparison, you are of course looking at the proposed location of a statue at Mons Claudianus, just outside of the fortlet enclosure. Gedon's recent study of the passage of convoys with textiles through the fort recorded on the Ostraka advanced the possibility of long-distance imports of Egyptian or Syrian textiles passing through the site. Other Ostraka refer to the arrival of garamantes with barley, possibly in the context of supplying goods to the garrison. The scale of what and who was involved in the trade exchange at Bu Njem has also become clearer in recent years. With references to Letzi's Magna and to ships in the military correspondence, there is confirmation of trade going both north and south through Bu Njem. Ceramic evidence points to the transport of supplies in the form of oil from Jagiellonian and salt and wine supplied from Tunisia. The site provides further examples of goods from the fort and the settlement, including shells recovered from the Principia building, most likely intended for consumption, as research by Dr. Leach has suggested. Given the distance these needed to travel while still fresh and the discard in the Principia building, the snails were likely for the consumption by high-ranking military personnel. Ostrich eggs are also attested, with several recovered from the fort and the extramural settlement. Graffiti from commercial structures within the settlement represent ships and a lighthouse, providing further confirmation of connectivity with the Mediterranean. Such evidence indicates that the garrison functioned in a permeable frontier across which people, animals, commodities, and ideas moved regularly. The information suggests that Bu Njem was an outward-looking point of contact, a military hub, but also an exchange center with a significant civilian and paramilitary presence in the form of an extramural community, involving servants, enslaved people, shopkeepers, women, and families of the military personnel, and local civilian communities further afield. A role as a regional center of administrative authority might be possible given that nearest cities were located on the coast and several other oasis settlements in the frontier zone were assigned an urban rank with administrative functions, serving as centers for tax collection, law, and local government. Research by the ERC Project Trans-Sahara team has indicated that major military bases in the North Sahara were built in proximity to establish oasis settlements. And this possibility exists at Bu Njem as well. As research by Gedon indicates, at times, the introduction of the army as a new source of authority resulted in the transfer of function of policing and administering justice from hands of the local readers onto the military authorities, changing how the local communities governed and organized themselves. Whether such processes could have been at play at Bu Njem is unknown, as is the legal status of the garrison town, which has no known inscriptions associated with it and no information in the ostraca. A potential civic administration role of Bu Njem is plausible in the context of the anomalously large Principia building, structurally and functionally parallel to a forum. The building covered 1,224 square meters, equivalent to roughly 13% of the area of the fort. By comparison, several forts in Europe normally have Principia buildings of a much more modest proportion. In contrast, the size of Bu Njem's headquarters compares rather well with that of its nearest contemporary neighbor Gariat. At 1,400 square meters, the building occupies 16% of the area of the base. Could this be a regional specificity of the area in question? Beyond a number of temples, no public buildings are known from Bu Njem garrison town, despite the French excavation team targeting the question of potential existence of an orthogonal grid and a civic structure. This may be significant if, for example, in addition to being a community center for the military, the fort also represented administrative and governance space for a regional community, with the walled garrison town providing additional commercial and religious foci. Dura Europos provides a near contemporary parallel, with documentary evidence of military officers acting as judges in civilian cases. However, unlike Bu Njem, Dura Europos had an extensive Roman palace, which offered large spaces for joint military and civilian gatherings, such as trials, and for political gatherings, such as sacrifices to the imperial cult. In the context of Bu Njem, its extensive Principia as the symbol and the seat of military power and a temple to the emperor most likely provided such focus for local political and religious events. Correspondence on the ostraca suggests diplomatic activities as well. So here you are seeing ostraca number 71, which records the arrival of Garamantes with letters for the prepositus of the garrison, with interpretations suggesting that it is possible that the letters were sent by the Garamantes themselves. Here, ostraca 28, whoops, not here, records Bu Njem soldiers being missus cum garamantibus, most likely serving as escort of a diplomatic delegation sent to the Garamantes. Frontier policies were decided on in the imperial capital, but the negotiation of frontier relations needed to implement them took place within the regional military zones. Bu Njem was distinctly urban-like, with its Principia building like a forum centrally placed within the settlement, and the fort's intramural facilities including baths, temples, street grid, and the use of Latin. These replicated an urban experience specifically for the citizen soldiers of the legion, whose mother base at Lambesis was accompanied by a canabe, and where a second separate urban area existed, listed by Ptolemy as a city. Proximity to the unit likely shaped the experiences of the garrison town too. The rhythm of life of its community, its makeup, its economy, with the military as important service and goods consumers, its culture through the influence of military culture, and its temporality through seasonality of cycles of military activity, including movements of detachments, as we have seen in the examples of the graffiti. The influence of the garrison also involved a military hierarchy of power at the heart of the spatial conception of a fort. At Bu Njem, this is seen in the presence of guards attested on daily reports, and as we have seen, in the monitoring of passage of convoys arriving through the site. With very few garrison settlements in the region having been subject to archaeological prospection, the 14-hectare Bu Njem settlement provides a rare insight into a garrison in the context of its community outside the walls. The excavation plan, alongside satellite imagery, indicate that the main gate to the military base, the East Gate, served as the beginning of an axis which culminated with a large rectangular structure at the eastern extremity of the settlement, aligned with the fort's east gate. Could this represent a gate to the walled town, with the sand dunes perhaps concealing a trace of a road? The rectangular structure was directly adjacent to a commercial complex, the so-called Bâtiment aux Niches, which is one of a number of identified commercial structures in the garrison town. Having entered the interior of the base through the east gate, the tentative route transformed into the forts via Principalis, leading past the Principia building and affiliated storage complex. The route would have then turned at 90 degrees angle at the Groma and then led out of the fort through the south gate. Satellite imagery shows traces of what could be a road leading out of the south gate into the southeastern direction, although it is unclear why, having left the base, the route turned again. While a limited portion of the layout of the settlement is known, we know that at least one of its thoroughfares might have led through the fort. While the structures in the town represent organic urban growth over the short lifespan of the settlement, the wall of the town itself is consistent in tracing the contour of the hill, perhaps signaling military oversight. On the northeastern side the settlement, there is evidence for extension enclosures built against the wall. Another extension is present in the northwestern corner of the settlement. Given the fragility of the wall, this might suggest individual agency of inhabitants in extending their properties. The peripheral location and the size of the enclosures hint that they might serve in relation to camels or caravan movement or trade, or as location for temporary keeping of animals raised in the hinterland of the town. With the extensions suggesting the rows as stock enclosures, caravan stops, or property boundaries, it seems that the town walls would only be appropriate for low-level security purposes, fit for containment and surveillance of caravans, people, and animals. Within the settlement, vaulted commercial structures with counters suggest that the extramural community depended on more than provision of goods and services to the small garrisons. Both the fort and the settlement became important stopping points on long-distance trade routes. Study of textual material revealed the variety of cultural identities of the inhabitants and travelers through Bu Njem, but the community's composition, including the role of women and children, still remains obscure, as it does in many areas of the Roman Empire. Only limited information regarding one unknown necropolis of the garrison town is available. The exceptions are two tombstones recording a young girl, as well as a funeral inscription commemorating a 1-year-old child. And here we see Julia Germana, who lived 10 years, and here she is clad in a dress. Please do get in touch if you have some further thoughts. And you're also seeing Sacred to the Gods Below tombstone of Oisius, who also has a second name and only lived for 1 year and 4 months. Much has changed in our outlook on extramural settlements since the excavation of Bu Njem, including a shift in thinking of fort walls as permeable to non-combatants as daily routines on military sites. A joint approach to the fort and the extramural settlement is needed to understand Bu Njem in the context of its role in trade networks as a connection point and as a local center of authority. Such an approach helps us understand Bu Njem as a place with multiple living communities, both military and civilian, with various levels of separation. This approach can be achieved by identifying activity areas within the fort relevant to understanding the military base as a point of contact. The concern for control of passage alluded to in the Ostraka recording civilian convoys is also visible in Bu Njem's duty rosters listing guard locations. Beyond the exceptional texts, Bu Njem also consists of an archaeological record that enables identifying some of such security-sensitive places. Information from the Ostraka can be set against the analysis of visibility lines, access points, and features such as benches. These allow identifying points of presence and considering how these guided movement through the fort. Um, Surveillance provided differentiated access to the fort's various spaces, and in this sense, the frontier was actualized through the act of passage through the militarized space. The east gate was the main entrance to the base, the only double-portaled gate. Garrison rosters referred to guard the gates. To the left of the doorway, outside the gate, there was a bench built against the facade of the tower. Whilst we cannot be entirely certain of its phasing, considering its position immediately outside of the perimeters, its use could relate to the control of access into the military enclosure. Control of entry is consistent with language of the Ostraka recording entry of civilian convoys into the base, which we shall return to later. The position of the bench against the south wall of the tower gates hints at the locus of activity, right at the entrance into the area of direct military control. The density of the extramural settlement could explain interest in control of access, but what could be the purpose of such a bench? One possibility is that the bench belonged to a space for non-military parties wishing to enter the fort to sell goods to the base, in accordance with the Ostraka, or to deal with Roman administration, for example, petitioners waiting to see military officials. The East Gate provides access to the Via Praetoria, with the headquarters building as its key structure. Here you can see its plan. The facade of the building is fronted with an extending wall on its south end. The extension wall is roughly 4 meters long and frames an L-shaped outdoor bench. On the opposite end of the facade of the building, the French excavation team encountered a parallel projecting wall. Although its entire course was not excavated. The two extension walls are comparable in their location to where one might find a forehole, and might suggest that the space, whether roofed or unroofed, could have performed parallel functions, providing shade and protection from sand and wind. Occupying the crossroads of the fort, an important circulation space, majority of foreholes are interpreted as shelter for activities associated with the granary and the front of the Principia building. A comparison is provided by Wall's End, in use between the mid-Antonine period and the early 4th century. While most of the group of over 30 known structures come from the British and German frontier, one of the better preserved examples comes from Lambesis, the headquarters of Bu Njem's legionary contingent. The Bu Njem arrangement might be related to a post at the entrance to the Principia building for inspections, issue of documentation, or control of movement on the Via Principalis, but the roles could be many. The extent of excavations at Bu Njem recorded on documentation does not entirely rule out the existence of a covered forehole spanning the central T-junction of the fort. The space in front of the Principia was at least 10 meters wide, which could accommodate a forehole that would be slightly narrower than that at Saalburg. The situation at Bu Njem could compare well with the small forehole across the Via Principalis at Dura Europos, which too was furnished with benches against its walls. If there was not a roof structure and instead the space remained open, the area might well have been covered with canopies, but it seems that it was an interesting space for activities. Moving on, the granary storage complex was a connected series of activity spaces encompassing a granary, a walled structure immediately outside to the south of the granary, and a room within the Principia's western range that opened onto the granary itself. The complex was enclosed to the south by the back of the temple of Genius Golensis, creating an open space which was accessible from the Via Principalis. The two granaries were supported by characteristic buttresses. A depression in the sand between the granaries and the commanding officer's house was originally seen as a building of an unknown function. The structure either as an open space or a roofed building, likely performed an ancillary function to the granary. This interpretation is supported by 1.6-meter wide threshold to both the western granary and the walled structure, suitable for loading cargo. This enclosed complex offers protection from wind-blown sand. It is possible that the openings of the granary and the walled structure were situated on the opposite sides to minimize congestion. As we take a closer look, a further feature is what is identified here as a sentry room. This was located in the western range of the building, directly overlooking the granaries, with the doors of both nearly fully aligned. The room 4, cannot have been used in connection with the interior of the Principia building, as it does not open onto its courtyard and can only be accessible from the open space located outside the granary. Original access between room 4 and room 3 was blocked, severing room 4 from the circulation in the Principia building. Room 4 was furnished with a masonry table and a bench. The table is located near the partition wall that divides the room into two. The table is of raised masonry with stone slabs supported by iron. The bench in room 4 has no functional relation to the table and instead provides a line of sight onto the passage between the Principia building and the granaries. Prolonged presence is suggested by graffiti, including this one of a gladiator published by René Buffon, and a larger graffiti of a line of soldiers on the western side of the partition wall above the table, confirming that the partition and the table were added during the use of the building as Principia. The opening onto the granary and the bench are original features, but the partition and the adjoining desk and the blockage of the door all belong to the same slightly later phase in the military use of the building. The table and the blockage of the original passage leading to room 3 suggest that room 4 could have been a guard post since its inception, perhaps commissioned as an office of a granary clerk at the time of the modification, providing desk space and excluding the room from the circulation in the Principia building. This proposed sentry room is not unique. The severn face at wall's end again provides a parallel to Bu Njem. Here, two small box-room chambers were added at the corners of the granaries, as Rushworth argued, likely corresponding with monitoring of reception and issuance of supplies. Other recently recovered guard chambers include one at the corner of the house of the prefect at Dura Europos, which too overlooked an internal gate. The Bu Njem roster represents only a slim selection of the documentation produced by the unit and does not record any assignments at the garrison granary. However, the preservation of Roman military documents is extremely low. Evidence of references to granaries on military duty rosters come from Dura Europos, with two references of assignments of guards at the Horeum, interpreted as the garrison granary. In a desert post, storage is a necessity, and it would be of concern in terms of security, especially food provisioning, which could justify supervision. This setup would also be a good fit for a location of reception and record keeping in terms of supplies. To bring these thoughts together, outdoor benches and short indoor benches providing direct vistas onto circulation spaces are interpreted here as signposting activity locations and as likely areas under surveillance. As many of you know, in the context of Italian cities, outdoor benches are correlated with commercial spaces and as waiting areas for clients visiting their patrons. As the military commander was the patron of his soldiers and a local source of authority, there is possibility for parallel use of spaces by the east gate and outside the Principia building as a reception or waiting area for non-military parties. Given the security-sensitive location near the gate to the fort and the Principia building, and Ostraka's sentry post, it is unlikely that the benches discussed here were associated with leisure, and that rather they served as a means of controlling access and providing waiting and activity spaces in areas where people could be easily observed. The bench associated with the fort's gate, the front of the Principia building, were not for the use of guards. This is suggested by canon of military representations of soldiers, arising from notions of military masculinity. Soldiers are usually depicted as standing, except for representations of on horseback or on ships or wagons. And here you've got some examples. The exception to that rule are military clerks, who would sit down to write. The context of room 4 in the Principia building, overseeing the access to granary and the desk-like feature in the chamber, might suggest that this was an office of such a clerk. References to guards in the Bu Njem ostraca suggest that the presence of guards in the spaces altered accessibility of buildings to providing points of authority and gaze. In addition to rosters attesting the presence of guards at gates, other entries include a non-specified watchguard guard called Alcerutor. Military correspondence informed the propositus about the garrison's daily traffic, including the movement of soldiers, civilians, and caravans, although the extent of this surveillance is subject to discussion. In contrast to the routine crossing of the fort perimeter by military personnel, the entry of civilians into the base was seen as unusual occurrence, which warranted reporting on, as we have seen in the context of Ostraka number 71 and 72. As names of the individuals bringing cargo are not specified on the ostraka recording the passage of civilians, it has been suggested that the traders were free to offer their goods to the garrison. It is likely that not all parties whose arrival at the checkpoint was noted were permitted entrance into the security-sensitive military enclosure. The language of the ostraka conveys specifically entrance through the garrison gate, suggests that the Garamantian convoy with barley from Ostraka 72 or entered the fort. In contrast, the text recording the arrival of cloth sellers utilized a word which was more ambiguous and did not record the identity of the arriving party. This lack of precision might signpost lack of the necessity to record identity of the arrival, as the convoy was likely passing through Bu Njem but remained outside of the fort enclosure. Surveillance of passage into the base attested in the ostraka is consistent with the proposal made here regarding a tentative waiting area furnished with a bench by the exterior of the east gate. The bench was located against the north-facing wall, likely to maximize shade coverage in the afternoon, the hottest part of the day. The shadow cast by the tower is visible in this aerial photograph. The outdoor bench in front of the Principia building was also positioned against northern-facing wall and so benefited from the shade. The benches formalized otherwise ephemeral activity spaces, and beyond consent for heat, wind-blown sand, seem to have been an additional issue. A dedication in the fort's bathhouse, which many of you will be familiar with, refers to the hardship of the desert, specifically southern winds. A bench protected by a wall from the south offered shelter from the heat and the wind-blown sand. Access from the east gate through the fort led to the fort's central range, with an activity area framed by benches, which we discussed earlier. The feature is interpreted here primarily in the context of monitoring the circulation on the fort's key crossroads. Given the intertwining of the garrison with the town, the sheltered central junction would provide meeting space for organized military and civilian contact that could easily be monitored through various lines of sight and presence in around the Principia building. We also discussed an adjacent zone of supply-related activity, with what I propose is a guard chamber overlooking the granary. Its primary function is likely to be that of issuance of supplies. At Wall's End, the addition of two small rooms has been correlated with the increased administrative oversight needed to keep separate accounts for both the infantry and the cavalry contingent of the base. One can only wonder if an alteration to the sentry room at Bu Njem could be related to such increased accounting pressure resulting from the changed occupation of Bu Njem from a single legionary vexillation to a mixture of two units. The feature might also represent part of a reception system for supplies into the fort. Barker's and Wilson's work indicates that several frontier forts and their surrounding settlements were markets within regional trade systems. We know that the military required some of the foodstuffs from the vicinity of the garrison, as the ostraka of transactions indicate that local Libyan producers brought small quantities of their agricultural surplus or grain and oil. Some could have been offered freely by the producers to sell to the garrison, whilst others were either purchased or perhaps requisitioned by the military. This is certain in the context of delivery of oil, sent by a procurator, likely purchased or perhaps more likely requisitioned from an oasis further away from Bu Njem. None of the texts in question mention that these were monetary transactions, raising questions whether some of the records could pertain to taxation in kind rather than purchase. The ostraca suggests that passage of supply convoys through the fort was a frequent occurrence, with soldiers signing the entry of passengers and goods allowed access into the perimeter of the base. In their basic form, as often, sorry, oof, unless providing supplies to the fort or incurred taxation, the question remains whether it was necessary or desirable for caravans to pass through the fort, rather than under military surveillance in town. The question brings us back to the statue. Is there potential? Its three potential roles as places where military oversight would not be expected have been raised. One, places where local farmers sold products to the military, a place for provision of water for the caravans, a customs post, and most recently a tax assessment point. As often argued, military control of water in a point of passage of caravans was an important aspect of military presence in the area, and the statue is understood to fulfill the role of caravanserai in a location near the garrison, but not within the garrison itself. In their basic form, as stops in the desert, these consist of a water point with a walled enclosure. In the context of a thriving settlement, water points would offer business opportunities of providing services to the convoys for the civilian population. Conveniently, the bâtiment or niche is adjoining the wall structure interpreted here as the gate into the town. If, as argued, only the groups dealing directly with supplying the army and the position of goods into the military stores were entered into the military enclosure, then it is possible that no one single place performed all of the functions linked to the statue, and that instead several places performed some of the roles of provisioning the caravans. I have tried to show that archival data provides research opportunities at a time when many archaeological sites are inaccessible for fieldwork. The findings perhaps indicate that control of access and of circulation featured visibly in the life of the garrison. The security-sensitive locations discussed here fit with the role of the fort and its garrison town as a stopping point on trade routes, with the intramural locations interpreted particularly in the context of reception of supplies for the garrison. At the same time, activities in the fort need to be viewed in the context of the extramural settlement. Scarcity of high-resolution excavation from extramural settlements in the region reflects the frontier research agenda at the time, focus on fortification and composition of the units. Increasingly, understanding of cultural, social, and economic complexities of extended military communities contributes to revising legacy approaches to the frontier, bringing closer the archaeologies of Roman armies and local communities. Given the small number of troops present in the rapid growth of the settlement, Bu Njem was largely an urban center with a military-run logistics and administrative core, controlling movement along trade routes and water points, and likely maintaining diplomatic relations with communities further south. Control of circulation and access illustrate that power can be written into the spatial culture of a place. The frontier was realized through people's experience of it as they came to contact with military power. Papyri from other military sites evidence the presence of soldiers in garrison towns, which is also certain at Bu Njem. Roster of a unit in Egypt refers to soldiers supervising at the weights, indicating presence in commercial spaces, likely in the nearby town. Reports from Dura Europos might refer to supervising grain stores in the city by a centurion. At Dura, soldiers were also stationed at city gates as key access points into the town. Could this have been the case at the gates of Bu Njem's town, perhaps to be identified with the rectangular structure discussed here? By comparison, with Dura and Oxyrhen's evidence, it does not seem plausible that the garrison would have left the town gates unguarded. If the fort gate was not the first point of surveillance on arrival to Bu Njem, could more sentries be expected within the town? Is it possible that Ostraka's statue represents one of several locations within military base and the town that were subject to increased military oversight? Considering Bu Njem as a patchwork of military-controlled spaces with different degrees of security is my proposed way forward for a more holistic interpretation of the archaeology of the fort and the garrison town and beyond. The military base was a military-controlled nucleus within a larger walled settlement rather than an entirely separate entity. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Anna. That was a really great presentation, and it's obviously such a interesting and fascinating site, and there's clearly so much more to think about with the site as you've shown. So just a reminder to all of our listeners that please, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box. And we do have a couple questions already that people have entered, so we'll dive right in and I will ask those. So we have one question from Fadiel Fadel. And they ask, what about the frontier between the west and east part of Libya during the Roman period? And they mention the Arch of the Fellaini.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I have not had much chance to study that part of the frontier, but I'll be absolutely delighted to find out more. So thank you for this very good question. If that's possible, I'd love to take your contact details to have a conversation.
Okay. Yes. I pop them again into the chat, or yes, you have, or Anna, your contact details were on the presentation, weren't they? Yes. Great.
Thank you.
Yes, okay, so a next question from David Baumgartner. Is there any evidence for the presence of an amphitheater attached to this site, as for example at Gemelli and Mesarfelta?
Not that I'm aware of. So I've read the reports by Professor Rebufo back and forth, and nothing as yet. But again, excavations were undertaken a long time ago, and as you could see, percentage-wise, not that much of it was excavated. So who knows?
Yes. Okay, another question from Ursula Lang. They ask, thank you for this exciting presentation, Anna. I enjoyed it a lot. Regarding the forehall of the Principia, this structure calls to my mind the example from the Aquincum legionary fortress, where there is a tetrapylon/gate structure similar to the one in Lambysis attached to the Principia. It might serve as an analogy. Best wishes.
That is an absolutely fantastic point. Thank you so much. So useful.
Yes, and another question from Thomas Millen. Regarding the masonry table found within your storage building, what scale of production do you think was going on there? And did you find anything or have anything that would indicate it was a commercial unit, or was it for maintenance of the fortification and settlement?
Okay, so are we talking about the masonry table in the Principia building? In which case, that in my mind is likely an office space for a cleric, in which case it would not be a commercial structure, but more of a records keeping area for the unit. And as you know, the dump of the ostraka was, I think, found behind the Principia building, so that's sort of consistent with that sort of record keeping of a unit. There are commercial structures within the extramural settlement, that Bâtiment Onish, which has been fantastically published by Professor Rebufo, has some fantastic features and counters. They look very much like shops. So that probably is where you would have more of a commercial structure. But in terms of the quality of how they were made, I'd love to know, but I only have access to a couple of photographs.
Excellent. We do just have a comment asking us to share the recording, please. And yes, all of our lectures are indeed recorded, and they will be on the Billness YouTube. You will find information about that on our website and our social media. It will be advertised. It might take us a couple days to get it uploaded, but we will certainly let everyone know when the recording is available. Please do follow our social media and our website for that information. We have another question here. Haider Dawi says, thank you for your lecture. Please consider making it a monthly practice. Can you highlight any proofs of religious life for soldiers, perhaps connections to the cult of Mithras or the cult of Gurzel, and about this being, is this a front line of cultural exchange?
Yeah, so I'm actually working on a chapter for the book about religion in Bu Njem. And Nicolo Munyai, fantastic colleague, has just published a lovely edited volume which has a summary of military sort of worship on the frontier. So there are five temples in Bu Njem. One of them is the tiny little temple of the genius, which is effectively a deity of the place. And there's a lovely article by Venerable before, and later Michael Spider also wrote about how that sort of came to be when the Romans arrived into Bu Njem, and apparently it was a difficult passage. So they set up a temple to a genius, a local deity. So we've got that. We also have two satellite temples outside of the town itself, which are sort of dedicated to gods which are half local, half Roman. So they have double sort of names, which is quite interesting. I think in total there are five temples. So watch this space. But there's been some work published on that earlier on, so I'm happy to send some links to it as well. But no, and as far as I know, no Mithras just yet. But yeah.
Um, and there was actually a second part of question, I think, for the same person. Any findings on the burial practices in the fort or around it?
Oh, I would love to know. I don't think that so. The people, the fantastic people at Son Camus Julien, and I definitely need to send my love to Veronique Blanc-Pigeon, have shown me some of the archive records, and that included some of these photographs of the tombstones. But in terms of the actual record of the cemetery, I don't think that's at anyone's disposal at the minute. It'd be lovely if it just showed up somewhere. But I think there would have been mostly cremations in that period of time. Anyway, but there's another tombstone on Roman inscriptions of Tripolitania online website, which is a tombstone of a man in his 30s, I believe. So we don't know terribly much about the community. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Next question. Anna Leone asks, in terms of the function of the fort as place for acquisition of documentation for tax payment at arrival, how do you see the complex related to other forts like Ras Al Ain and Ramada?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Anna. I think we only met online maybe once. It's so generous of you to spend your time listening to me. I really appreciate your time. That's a very good question. I haven't looked at these sites in detail, so that's definitely in the once the first draft of the book is complete comparison stage of the work. So if I may, I would definitely get in touch with you.
Um, let's see, a few more questions here. Gary Rager, I do apologize if I'm butchering anyone's names. He says, hi, Anna, you've done a great job. As I'm sure you know, we now have lots of evidence for prostitution organizations serving soldiers in the Egyptian Eastern Desert. Have you
Oh
seen any
yeah.
indications of the same thing at Bu Njem?
Oh, I know which evidence you're referring to, the fantastic Ostraka published from the Forklets, and this that's fantastic material. Not as not as yet, but I can imagine that's something that would have been part of military life. But the Eastern Desert is a fantastic source of evidence. I'm sure you've probably seen the work that shows all the connectedness between different people working in the business, and that's a fantastic glimpse. If only we had that everywhere in terms of evidence.
Um, Next, we have a question from David Breeze,
Oh,
who says,
hi, David.
I too enjoyed your talk, thank you. There are more rooms on each side of the courtyard than usual, at least in relation to European forts. Have you
Mhm.
any thoughts on these, and could these be where the ostraca were stored?
That's a very good question. Or it could be that some of it was related to that proposal or originally, and it's an idea I shamelessly stole from the Trans-Saharan volume on urbanism, where they proposed a sort of civic function, and actually that works very well in comparison with work on the northern British frontier. I think ages ago, Martin Millett mentioned that a long time ago. But yes, so it could be that there are more rooms because there's more administrative functions to cover. But in terms of the Ostraka, I think they were mostly from a dump behind the main Principia building. But which room they were stored in, I would love to know. But who knows?
Yeah.
Thank you, David, for your time and generosity. It's been a long time since I've seen you, so thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Um, Excellent. Okay, a few more questions. We're keeping you busy. So we have a question from Alan Rushworth, who
Oh,
asks,
hi.
regarding the size of the garrison, I wonder if it was initially something in the order of 500, perhaps reflecting
Mhm.
the propagandistic aspects of the Severan advance, but declining to more realistic levels later in the 3rd century.
That is a fantastic observation, Alan. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's it. That's actually very interesting. Okay, I should definitely have a think about. Thank you again, Alan, for your time. I'm definitely feeling the support from the north of the country. Thank you so much. Great to have you here.
Um, So we have here, oh, just a follow-up from Fadia Fadel, who asked a question earlier, who just says, I live not far from Bu Njem and close
Oh,
to
wow.
in the oil crescent of Libya. And they say, I offer my support if wanted as a civil society activist. So I think Anna would love
Oh,
to hear from you.
I would love to. I would love to. So I'm not sure if you're on Twitter, but I'll share. Oh my gosh, shall I write down my email address? Yes. Can I write it somewhere?
Um, I'm not sure actually. Oh yes, if I will change it. If you put it in the chat.
I have. So I have been I've been a bit cheeky. So I've been on italki, which is a fantastic platform for learning languages, trying to meet people who live near the areas of that I study, just to sort of learn more and learn the language. So yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. And another question. Oh, and Fadil has put their email in the, can you see the Q&A box?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay, another question from Haider Dawi. Any proof of dragging water via subterranean channels? Any finds on the water infrastructure and the connection to water reserves nearby?
That's a very good question. So I haven't heard anything about water channels. There's been there was a paper published by a graduate student in America, and I can't quite remember his name, but I can find the details to the of the paper that sort of looked at the environmental aspects of water management at Bu Njem. So that's a very important part of the story, and a lot of the Ostraka deal with effectively sending men to service the bathhouse. So the bathhouse in itself is a really fantastic statement of very sort of Roman identity, and the graffiti there are also pretty incredible. What is particularly interesting is that if you look at the proportion of how many blogs they send to do things related to the to the bathhouse, it's a big proportion of the men registered on the duty rosters. So water is definitely something of interest, and especially thinking about bathhouse and bathing and as an expression of Roman identity in the desert, that's absolutely mind blowing.
Um,
Yes, please.
I'm going to skip down a bit because there's another question that is related to that, I think, from Thomas Millen. But so how far does Bu Njem then fit within controlling access to water and key spots, key rest spots between the north and the south?
I think it fits very much into that discussion, and it's obviously discussion that was started way before I even took interest there in Bu Njem, and a lot of the classic literature mentions it. So yes, absolutely, controlling resources is particularly important.
Um, okay, next. Susan Walker says, thank you for a very interesting presentation. And she has a question from John Wilkes. If you were traveling towards the coast in that area of the desert, could you have avoided going through Bu Njem?
That is a very good question. I think that's a question for Stephanie Guedon, who was absolutely amazing, and she's done so much work on the trackways and circulations. But I guess, and I refer also to your greater knowledge here, Nicole, how easy it is to not go on the route where you know you have stopping points and water access. How easy is it to divert?
Gosh, I mean, yes, it's a very good question. I mean, I think it would be difficult, and it would, of course, it would depend on your experience in the region, you know. So for someone who perhaps lived there all their lives, perhaps it would be easier to find other ways around. But if you're someone who's unfamiliar with the area, you'd probably be best served by keeping to the
To
to
the
the route,
tracks.
I would think.
But that's an interesting idea about perhaps escaping the taxation and surveillance.
Okay. Um, yeah, so next from Graham Barker. He says, your website says you are interested in the social construction of time. Do you have
Yes.
any reflections on this topic in relation to the military and non-military population at Bu Njem?
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, Graham, you probably don't remember me, but you were in Cambridge when I was a master's student. I was fresh off the boat from Poland, and I very fondly remember you giving a lecture. So I'm very privileged to have you in the room. Thank you so much. Yes, I actually have a bit of a paper which looks at the construction of time. So part of it is really comparing the temporality of Bu Njem with the Vindolanda tablet. So obviously we are in the north of the empire and the south, and you've got the question of climate and the heat. And what I'm trying to argue is just as we sort of dissolve this question of sort of monotonous uniformity of military code or practice or religion, the same should probably apply to military temporality. And when you look at some of the inscriptions from Bu Njem, particularly the ones in the bathhouse or the gate, and also the dates when the works were undertaken, it becomes clear that some months were better for certain type of work and some not. And it's almost a totally different sort of mode of operation in terms of time than what you see on the Vindolanda tablet. There's also the question of how long the day was in an era without, of course, artificial light. So that's one part of the question. The second part of the question, which I'm sort of advancing, and here I need to send thanks to a lovely colleague at Nottingham in the Department of History, who works on 1950s Algeria and notions of resistance and time, is really about how whether we can think of the empire as also changing temporalities as it sort of advances, and how the military has its own form of temporality. Because obviously we've got the clocks, we've got the calendars, we've got the presence of the emperor in how dates are measured. So yeah, that's definitely something that I'm thinking about, and Bu Njem is very much part of the core evidence. So thank you so much, and it's so fantastic to have you here. What a privilege.
Okay, just a couple more questions. Ursula Lang asks another question saying, were there any traces of industrial activities inside the fort?
Uh, well, that's a very good question. So as you notice, and Professor Mackinson has recently also alluded to it in Nicola's edited volume, there is something that looks like a fabrica, which is a repair workshop in Bu Njem, and it's an elongated structure adjoining the one of the sort of ramparts. So we know that that was there. But because the artifactual evidence is just so rubbish, it's difficult to say anything more beyond that. But this sort of repair activity would have been a normal part of military day-to-day life.
And we just have a comment here just related to the earlier conversation from David Breeze, just saying that the modern road obviously passes by the fort, or at least it did in 1967 when when he visited.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Um, Another couple questions. One from Khalifa Bashbash. I would like to know about the inscriptions discovered in Bu Njem. We know that
Mhm.
many unique inscriptions were discovered there. Are there new efforts, whether in terms of study or documentation?
That's a very good question. So I'm looking at the inscription as part of my work on Bu Njem, and I don't know, maybe you guys are much smarter than me, and you will know some of the tombstones which you've seen in this presentation. I haven't seen them on the Roman inscriptions of Tripolitania online, so I don't know what that means, if they just haven't made it to the online repository, or if they somehow maybe were missed somewhere. But that's a very good question. There are quite a few inscriptions, and I don't think there's anything much more modern and substantial than Aysen Cooley's fantastic work, and it's in this handbook of epigraphy. I think part of it is available open access, and that's a really lovely take on the multicultural, multilingual nature of the community. I think the multilingualism at Bu Njem in itself would require someone who knows social linguistics, because of course you've got all this fantastic material which uses Punic alphabet as well, especially in the commercial structures in the town. So then there's the question, okay, so what language do we use in the fort, and what language did the community use, and in which context? Or you have this lovely graffiti which are the Latin alphabet, but then you have some scribbles in the same building. in a Punic alphabet. So there's definitely multilingualism going on there. So in terms of inscriptions, that's a very good question, but it also makes me think about graffiti too. But yeah, Alison Cooley's work, fantabulous.
Um, okay, next question from Sharif Hamed. Is there any evidence of a reading room in the fort? Was it for soldiers, Libyans, or perhaps for visitors to the fort?
That's a very good question. So in terms of reading room, huh? So there's another part of the Principia called so-called the scriptorium, which has another one of those pulpits, right? But it's in a very awkward place where the benches are a bit too far away for you to sit and write, and the pulpit is too tall for you to sit and write. So it looks like it would have been someone standing and maybe reading the documents whilst others were listening to you reading. And that's probably according to sort of the received wisdom of how we look at military spaces again for the use of military administration. But these are really fantastic questions, and I'd love to particularly thank all the fantastic colleagues from North Africa whom I've never met. It's so lovely to have you here, and I'd love to keep in touch with you all.
Okay, we've got one comment from Philip Kenrick, and then one last question, and then we will let you let you escape, Anna.
No
So
worries.
Philip mentions, with regard to bypassing the fort, it's worth noting the timeless realities of geography in this sort of terrain.
Mhm.
The Italians built a fort here because, again, this was a nodal point in north-south
Uh-huh.
travel, which people were obliged to pass by.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. It's a very good comment. I think it sort of responds to one of the questions earlier on. So it's great to see the audience in conversation as well. So thank you so much.
Okay, and so our final question from Hayder Dawi, another one. So they say, you mentioned a space related to governing, settling cases or disputes, for example. Were there any stone seats or any architectural elements that stood out in the fort for this function?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. My internet cut out for a second. Could you
Oh.
go ahead? Sorry.
In relation to a space related to governing inside the
hmm
fort, so for settling
hmm
cases and disputes, were there
hmm
any stone seats or any architectural elements, furniture that you can identify for this function?
Not as yet, not at the minute. And if you think about it, not that much of the internal furnishing is actually preserved. So if you look at Rebuffal's original plans, there's, for example, one base for an altar in the middle of the Principia courtyard. We also know that there would have been an upper story because there's a staircase on the hand side of the Principia building. So a lot of it is missing, but that's a very good question. And this is where I need to have a very good look at the features in Dura Europus to see what Simon James and others sort of made of them to see if there is a more of a comparison. But these are absolutely fantastic questions. Thank you so much.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think it just remains for me to thank you, Anna, again for a really interesting talk and something that's clearly generated a lot of interest and a lot of questions. It's been really wonderful to have so many questions from our audience, and clearly so much interest. So thank you again.
Thank you so
Very much.
much. I'll just say one more thing or two more
Yes, of
things
course.
very quickly. So first of all, I'm always very keen to publish open access because when I didn't have access to a university library, it's really difficult to get things. So I have some good news, which is there may or may not be an open access edited volume coming out with some interesting work that you might find. So I'll make sure that I link it on Twitter. And secondly, I'm also looking after a conference which is specifically about theory in Roman archaeology. So it's called Theoretical Roman Archaeology Conference. So if any of our colleagues would love to be involved, and we always look to embrace people from across parts of the Roman Empire, former and present, please do find us on Twitter and on the Classicist mailing list. We'd love for you to get involved. So thank you, and thank you everyone for your time. I know there are so many different things you could be doing with your time, so thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna. And just before everyone leaves, I would just like to mention that our next Billness lecture will be on Tuesday, the 15th of April, and we will be having Christian Goranson, who is going to tell us about Greeks and Libyans in ancient Cyrenaica, cooperation and conflict. So please do sign up for that. If you enjoyed today's lecture, I'm sure you will enjoy Christian's as well. You can find out details and register at our website, billness.org. Please look out for emails and on social media. And thank you, Anna, again. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. I will share all the messages to Anna on chat, and I will now close the call. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.